We're getting closer and closer to the mother of all economic depressions, and its effects are about to bring about an unprecedented amount of turbulence, chaos, and despair to our modern society. The horror stories from the Great Depression of the 1930s are about to be repeated. Most preppers have that grim era burned in their minds as a stark reminder of how fast things can go wrong, even in the wealthiest country in the world. And today, global events are rapidly accelerating and things are spinning out of control at an alarming pace in the United States. For decades, preppers had the Great Depression as a motivation and a reminder to get ready for dark times, even before things start to go bad. But the truth is that this is the scenario all of us should be preparing for. Recently, several economists, financial analysts, and market watchers have been warning that another Great Depression is coming, and it will throw us back into an era of poverty, hunger, and distress that is likely to start by the end of this year. Many may argue that those warnings may be too extreme or too alarmist, but there's plenty of evidence supporting their view, too much to just dismiss. In real terms, the Great Depression stretched for 4 painful years from 1929 to 1933, but it was only 7 years later, in 1940, that the US economy bounced back to its 1929 level. And even then, the national unemployment rate was still at 15%. Last year, when the health crisis struck America, the economy has fallen into a deep recession in a matter of days. Over 700,000 unemployment claims were filed within a few short months, and the US GDP dropped by 31.4% in the second quarter, the deepest and fastest collapse ever recorded. However, due to the extraordinary amount of printed money artificially injected into the system by the Federal Reserve, our economy has become numb. These measures may have averted a greater collapse in the short term, but they created huge imbalances that are now threatening to bring the entire system down. Even though many businesses have managed to recover from the damage that resulted from lockdowns, most of them are still struggling to resume operations and facing mounting debts. Our economic foundation is in fact very fragile, which means we're still in deep trouble, and the government is setting the stage for even more trouble in the months ahead. There's a lot going on in the backstage of the House of Cards, and one wrong move could trigger a chain reaction and unleash a depression that would hit us fast and hard. Millions of Americans are still out of work. Our national unemployment rate is standing around 6%. That's a moderate number compared to the 14.7% during the peak of the recession. But we're still very far from the 3.2% we had in 2019. Although the country is now experiencing a serious shortage of workers, job growth has significantly slowed over the past 18 months. In the 6 months after the peak of the recession, unemployment fell by nearly 7%, but from then on, it only fell by roughly 1% over the next 9 months. Even after government stimulus programs expired, workers did not come back to their jobs. As a result, our labor force has remarkably shrunk, and several industries cannot bounce back to previous levels because they're extremely short-staffed. In essence, those trillions in printed money failed to provide assistance for those who were financially struggling, because the vast majority of them are still struggling. And it's also failed to prop up the economy because now we have a reduced output limiting economic growth and rampant inflation pushing the cost of everything to sky highs. Every dollar in those government stimulus checks was either created out of thin air by the Fed or borrowed from the Treasury. At some point, the consequences of having expanded our money supply by the trillions would start knocking at our doors. That's why now we're facing an inflationary spike like no other seen in modern times. By creating and borrowing all of that money, as opposed to what many think, our country did not get richer, nor stronger, or more resilient. It has actually become more indebted than ever, and at the same time, our currency has become less valuable. To make things worse, the price of essential goods, such as housing, has jumped to record highs, so Americans now have to spend a lot more money to buy or rent a home. That also contributes to making the dollar weaker and inflation even more persistent. As our currency gets debased, we have to pay more for imported goods, such as oil. Consequently, gas prices are bound to surge, and car prices get more expensive too, because we import a lot of cars from other countries. So, while imports get more expensive, our domestic supply of goods can't keep up with the growing demand because our factories aren't operating at full capacity because there are not enough workers to do the job. The whole system is connected, and when one factor starts to falter, that creates a ripple effect, and we start to witness one failure after another. Given the steep imbalances between supply and demand, prices are ruthlessly rising all around the world. Companies are having to pay more for energy and raw materials, so they pass along those costs to consumers. Higher gas prices and transport costs are also added to consumer prices. Therefore, even though we now have more dollars in the economy, our purchasing power has significantly declined. The government tries to make up for the runaway inflation by passing laws that raise the minimum wage, but that raise isn't enough for customers to fight inflation, because companies end up passing those increased labor costs to consumers too. After inflation infiltrates the system, it starts to feed on itself, and it takes off like a rocket. Ever since the Fed stepped in with its monetary policies, our money supply has started to inflate by about $1 billion per hour. On the other hand, our national debt is surging so rapidly that it's hard to keep track. Over the next 2 or 3 years, we will be paying more on debt interest than we do on pretty much anything else. By 2030, debt interest is expected to match and then exceed tax revenues. That means we will have to borrow and print more money to pay the interest on the money we borrowed and printed throughout the last recession. No wonder why so many economists say our economic system will melt down way before that. Now, even Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell is acknowledging that inflation has become a major problem and that it won't disappear as soon as the bank previously predicted. That is to say, if the federal government keeps pumping more printed money into the system, inflation will become unmanageable sooner than most people think, and we will be doomed to face a devastating crisis that will last for years. There are many signs pointing that it has already started. Housing prices escalated by 23% in just 1 year. Used car prices shot up by 45%. Food prices have increased by a staggering 33% compared to last year. All of this is making inflation even worse, and it might be too late for the government to get the situation back in control. The smart ones will be ready in advance for the Great Depression that is looming on the horizon, and if you want to be prepared for the turbulence that lies ahead, there are some simple things you can start doing now. The most common rule of prepping is to stockpile the goods you need before they disappear from store shelves. Learn a practical skill so you can barter your service for other goods or services that you'll need later on. Keep a stash of money outside the banking system. Some argue that the best way to protect your wealth is by owning physical gold and silver. Get rid of all your debt while you can. In that way, you become untraceable in the system. Come up with a bug-out plan, because if things get out of hand too fast, you will already have the tools you need to survive and know exactly when and how to act. Learn self-defense skills and how to use self-defense tools. Learn how to grow your own food, raise animals, and how to forage, because you will be lucky to find what you need in stores, and even if you do, you may not be able to pay for it. Keep water filters and purifiers on hand. Stockpile batteries and solar-powered devices. Most importantly, do not blindly trust the government or the corporate media, and keep alert to the signs that things may be changing for good. The Depression of the 1930s caused a lot of damage to our country, but the next crisis will be far, far worse. Today, our economy is much more interconnected, and if the US goes down, the rest of the world will suffer too. No one will come to our rescue, especially now that all major economies are experiencing continued disruptions. Have you ever imagined what a world without enough energy for everyone looks like? Or without enough food? Have you ever considered what you will have to do to survive in a world of limited resources? because that's what you should start thinking about right now. This is going to be our future, and most people remain unaware of the risks and threats that are coming for us. But you have been warned, so the only question left is, are you prepared?